Hey everyone, hope you're all having a great day. So it's been a while since I've last made a video because I've been a bit busy with other things in my life, but now I'm back, and today I wanted to talk about something that I consider to be a very important topic, and that is the question, or perhaps the challenge, of how do you deal with toxicity. On this channel, I often like to talk about things related to cultivating a positive mindset and just an overall improved sense of well-being. Unfortunately, not everyone shares that same mentality, and in trying to be a more positive person, inevitably one of the major challenges is learning to deal with the negativity of those around you. In competitive games, oftentimes one of the most frustrating parts has to do with the people who play the game and the way they choose to interact with others. In particular, toxicity is something that appears commonly in competitive games as a result of an environment that combines high-pressure situations with anonymity. Without the risks to social reputation that is characteristic of most social interactions, people tend to speak more freely on the internet, and as you may be familiar with, that freedom usually is used in less than ideal ways. But of course, toxicity is definitely not limited to just the internet, and you can probably think of an example in your own life where you've encountered toxic behaviors when dealing with people even in person. The question of how can you deal with toxicity is a challenge that many are familiar with. Typically, the most popular suggestion is simply to ignore it. And while this is not necessarily bad advice, it might not be particularly helpful to the kind of person who needs to ask this question in the first place. After all, the reason one would ask such a question is precisely because they already have trouble ignoring it. Even if one accepts that we shouldn't let the behaviors of others dictate our emotional state, it's often easier said than done to pretend as though we are unbothered by the things that bother us. Like many things in life, resistance to toxicity is a skill you can develop through a change in perspective and practice. Some people are innately better at this than others, and that's okay. Muting and blocking is a decent practical solution online, but if you want to immunize yourself against toxic behaviors, I would say counterintuitively, the best thing to do is actually to expose yourself to as much toxicity as possible. Of course, only to the extent that you're capable of handling it. Toxicity can come in varying degrees, and in its most simple form is just any behavior or language that is harmful. This description is quite broad and would obviously include the typical personal insults and derogatory slurs, but controversially could also include things like saying GG easy or teabagging. In the gaming community specifically, I think it's fair to say that certain negative behaviors tend to be more normalized than they are in other contexts. GG easy, for example, or an equivalent phrase, expressing how great you are at a particular skill compared to someone else, is generally categorized as banter by gamers, but would undoubtedly be pretty cringe and probably unacceptable in other contexts. Ultimately, unlike physical harm, which is pretty consistent across all humans, emotional harm is not so straightforward, and is inevitably very personal and subjective. What is considered emotionally harmful to one person might not be to another, and is largely dependent on the culture in which you were raised in. For example, in some cultures, insulting someone's mother might be the most offensive thing you could possibly say, and yet in other cultures, although not necessarily nice, it would just sound very silly. Drawing these somewhat arbitrary lines between what should and shouldn't be considered acceptable is maybe a conversation for another day, but today I wanted to focus on how you deal with the most blatant forms of negative behavior from those around you. If you've played competitive games for any amount of time, you've almost certainly been insulted in various ways before, ranging from simply being called bad at the game, being told to uninstall, or having someone question the state of your mental faculties to a rather unreasonable degree. When it comes to dealing with toxicity, there's sort of two sides to the question: how you deal with it emotionally and mentally, and how you deal with it functionally and strategically. Emotional regulation and awareness is a pretty large topic that can't be covered in a single video, but in short, I think the most important realization when it comes to handling unwanted emotional discomfort is recognizing that being uncomfortable with certain things isn't something that you really need to feel bad about. If you find yourself struggling to deal with certain things more than you think you should, it's often tempting to think that there's something wrong with you as a person, but I think the better way to think about it is that sometimes we're just not innately good at certain things for a variety of reasons, and that's okay. Some people are great at eating spicy foods, and some people aren't. It's often the case that those people who have a high tolerance for spicy foods will make fun of others who aren't able to put nuclear reactors into their mouth. But in reality, tolerance for many things in life is a result of a combination of nature and nurture, and is not something that you can decide for yourself, like how you can decide to wiggle your toes. And while it probably is possible to practice and improve, if you find yourself struggling emotionally dealing with various negative situations, attempting to will yourself to feel differently will only stand to make yourself more frustrated than you already are. In my experience, the best way to handle unwanted negative emotions in response to something like toxicity is to take it slow, and instead of trying to change how you feel directly, aim to simply understand and accept how you feel for what it is, and aim to recognize that you can still make your own decisions even if it goes against your natural impulses. You don't need to wait until you feel good to make good decisions, and counterintuitively, one of the best ways to change how you feel about something is actually by changing your actions. If someone behaves in a bothersome way around you, it makes sense that you might feel at the very least a bit bothered by it. The important thing to remember is that you should still evaluate your decision making in a healthy way. Having said that, the big question is, what is the best way to deal with bothersome or toxic people? I think the major rule of thumb is to understand that you should always try your best to limit your interactions as much as possible, keeping your responsiveness to a minimum and only reacting as much as you need to. The most common mistake when it comes to dealing with difficult people is simply reacting way more than they need to. This is in large part because of the natural compulsion we feel to respond to others in a social setting, but in reality, in any setting where nobody owes anyone anything, and especially where you don't owe anyone anything, it's important to recognize that those who do not behave thoughtfully do not deserve thoughtful responses. You only have a limited amount of time and attention and energy, so don't give it away to people who haven't earned it, especially not when you're spending your valuable free time in a recreational activity like playing a game. I think one of the best slogans to govern 99% of online interactions is "It's not that serious, who cares?" If other people want to ruin their free time, that's up to them, but don't let your free time get wasted by taking others more seriously than you need to. Ultimately, it just doesn't matter that much. In the context of online games, this just means that the vast majority of the time, people who are saying you're bad at the game, telling you to swap off your favorite character, or other similar things can safely be ignored entirely. Remember, the people venting their frustrations at you are not paying you anything, nor is there any statement in the terms of service that says that it is your responsibility to resolve their frustrations. Neither you nor anyone else in your games gains or loses anything based on the outcome. Even if you're playing ranked and you are the worst player who has ever played the game and you are 100% entirely at fault for losing, if your teammate is hard stuck, you're not the reason that that's happening. And if they're not hard stuck, then surely they have nothing to worry about, and after the game ends, both of you can move on and go next. Of course, we do have to recognize that most of the time, the compulsion to react to toxic people is because instinctively, most of us don't like bullies, and of course, we also don't like to be disrespected. Certainly, no one likes to be disrespected, maybe with the exception of certain people in very specific situations. But at some point, it benefits us to realize that there will always be some silly person out there who will be rude to you for no reason, and no amount of arguing or debating is going to change that. In games, specifically, it's not your responsibility to make someone else a better person or teach them a lesson, and even if it was, the few minutes you have within a match is definitely not the kind of environment to be having intellectual discussions. And as a side point, having silly arguments with random people on your team in the middle of a game can in some ways even be considered somewhat disrespectful to the other people on your team. We're often conditioned to believe that we need to be that cool main character in a movie who always has a witty punchline in response to their antagonists, but as cool as it may look in a movie, I don't think it's a healthy thing to model in real life. Not only does the hero persona look pretty ridiculous from an outside perspective, it's not actually a good path to solving interpersonal issues. Self-confidence is important, but it doesn't mean that you can't be calm and kind. And in fact, I would reckon that presenting yourself as a calmer and kinder person when faced with confrontation is actually a much better display of strength than being a so-called tough guy. I think there's a certain peace to be had from realizing that you're not the main character. It means that you don't have to deal with everyone else's nonsense, nor do you have the ability to anyway, and I think that's overall a good thing. That's not to say that you should let other people take advantage of you, but it means that you don't worry about every little meaningless thing that anyone says about you unless you have to. Being confident means that you recognize that you live in a social environment where maybe you do consider the opinion of others, but you don't have an overemphasized need for validation. And the flip side of that is that you also don't care that much about invalidation either, especially if it's not coming from a reasonable position. It makes no sense to attempt to reason with unreasonable people, since they'll probably just drag you down to their level. When it comes to people who consistently exhibit toxic behaviors, oftentimes it can come from an innate, narcissistic personality, and usually, such people might sound like they're making an intellectual objection, but in reality, they're usually just looking for a fight. For people who view themselves as better than everyone else, confrontation for confrontation's sake is a good thing because it gives them a chance to prove just how much better they are than you. As such, this goes back to the point about why you should react as minimally as possible. On top of saving your own time and sanity, reacting to someone whose only purpose of engagement is to start a fight is simply giving them what they want. And so by not reacting, you're actually taking away the only reason they have to confront you, and therefore will usually get them to move along out of your way much sooner. In-game, this is why it's usually not advisable to respond at all to anyone who rudely complains. Regardless of whether or not they have the right to complain, complainers will complain, and are usually more interested in typing out their frustrations than actually having an intellectual discussion about your team's strategy. And so any attempt to communicate just serves to justify more time wasted typing, and sometimes the things people say might not even have anything to do with the real reason they're frustrated in the first place. Sure, sometimes people will continue to say the same silly things even if no one responds to them, but in those cases, there's still no functional benefit in taking the time to confront them, since nothing you could possibly say would convince them to behave differently. Inevitably, it feels wrong when we let silly people get away with being silly, but I think the key realization to make is that being silent doesn't necessarily mean that you're not saying anything. In common wisdom is that actions speak louder than words. When we don't directly respond to toxic people, we often believe that this means we're tolerating that kind of behavior, but in my opinion, not giving people the time of the day is actually the best response to toxicity, because it shows precisely that you very much don't tolerate that kind of behavior to the point that you don't even give it a single second of your time. And this is why, in my opinion, the best response is usually no response at all. If you really want to communicate that a certain kind of behavior is unacceptable, it's almost never productive or necessary to communicate that explicitly. Instead, by not giving it your attention, you communicate more effectively that that kind of behavior isn't something you take seriously. And the less negativity you let into your life, the more time you can spend being a more positive person. That's all I have to say for now. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment to support the channel. Feel free to let me know your thoughts about how you deal with toxicity. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.